This is the Managing Microsoft SharePoint Backups lesson. This is the 7th lesson in this course. In this lesson, you'll learn about the function of Microsoft SharePoint Server and the NetBackup for SharePoint agent. You'll identify components and terminology of Microsoft SharePoint. You'll learn to configure NetBackup for SharePoint policies and recover SharePoint resources. This is the Introduction to Microsoft SharePoint Server topic. Microsoft SharePoint is used to create many types of sites where you can collaborate on web pages, documents, lists, calendars, and data. A SharePoint farm includes related SharePoint servers, and this example on the slide here shows a farm and highlights the three-tier architecture that we see in large SharePoint deployments. The first tier, the web tier, consists of one or more front-end web servers, which is what the users primarily interact with. The second tier, the application tier, is mostly an information management tier, which handles functions such as indexing and search. The third tier is the database tier. These are the back-end SQL servers, which contain the actual content. NetBackup 7.7 supports SharePoint Server versions 2007 through 2013. As the slide notes, always check the NetBackup master compatibility lists for the specific version of NetBackup you're using to get the most up-to-date compatibility information. This slide shows a comparison of the terminology used in different SharePoint versions. And you can see that as the product has evolved, names for functionality, in many cases identical functionality, has changed slightly over time. Even the name of the product itself has evolved to some point. Now, SharePoint 2003 is no longer supported by NetBackup, but the terms are just shown here as a comparison. You'll notice that between 2010 and 2013, there's no real major changes in terminology, but some older tech notes or older forum posts you may be reading about protecting SharePoint might refer to different components using the older 2007 or 2003 lingo. This slide shows an example of a medium to large-sized SharePoint farm, specifically highlighting where the NetBackup client needs to be installed. We need to have the NetBackup client installed on the front-end web servers, which in many ways is the gateway to the SharePoint farm, through which NetBackup does a lot of discovery of resources. We also want to have the NetBackup client installed on the system that hosts the SharePoint index, and we also want to have the NetBackup client installed on all of the database servers that are hosting the actual content for the web applications. NetBackup performs discovery functions through the front-end web servers. Just as the web servers are sort of the front door for users of these web applications, they're also the front door for NetBackup to access the SharePoint farm. The topology of the farm is read from these front-end web servers, and then from there, NetBackup automatically builds a backup selections list to protect data. This slide indicates the data movement during SharePoint backup jobs. NetBackup may discover the resources through the front-end web servers. However, the actual backup jobs do not funnel everything through the front-end servers. That would be a huge bottleneck. Instead, a backup stream is initiated directly from each database and index server, and it travels from the SharePoint host, for example, the SQL database server, directly to the NetBackup media server. Note that the SharePoint agent is not capable of performing off-host backups or multi-streaming, which can sometimes be an issue for large SharePoint databases. And there are times when very large SharePoint farms may choose, for example, to use the NetBackup for SQL agent to protect the SQL database servers rather than the SharePoint agent for that reason, to be able to have better performance through multi-streaming or off-host backups. There's a real give and take there because the SharePoint agent is required if you want to do GRT, granular recovery. On the other hand, the SQL Server agent might give you better backup performance that you are looking for. So you really have to kind of balance your needs in that respect. The SharePoint agent supports granular recovery technology, or GRT, of items from the web applications stored in the SQL database servers. And this slide gives a high-level view of the granular recovery process during the backup. The first step is that the SQL database is backed up to disk. And then the second step, after the backup is complete, the disk image is mounted to the SharePoint server over the LAN using NFS. And then the third step is the SharePoint database is enumerated and its structure is recorded in the NetBackup image catalog to support the granular recovery of individual items. Not all items in the database can be restored through GRT. There are specifics about that in the SharePoint admin guide. Note that when it comes to GRT, and of course this applies to all NetBackup agents that use GRT, the initial storage location must be disk. And if you're going to do a restore, the restore must come from disk. Random access is a must for GRT operations. Now, if you wanted to do a GRT backup to disk and later duplicate it to tape, that's fine, and the GRT information will be retained on tape. However, the restore has got to come from disk. Microsoft SharePoint currently supports several methods for authentication. You can use Active Directory, you can use form-based authentication or claims-based authentication. Moving forward, Microsoft will eventually require everyone to use claims-based authentication. Right now, they're trying to steer everyone in that direction and to consider other types of authentication as deprecated. Eventually, they'll be removed from future versions of SharePoint. Claims-based authentication is based on a concept of identity that works with any identity system, including third-party authentication providers and multi-vendor environments. An identity is represented by a security token, and when a user needs to access an application, the security token is presented to the application to establish identity. Claims-based authentication provides a trust-based system between applications and a centralized token provider. In CBA, an application trusts the user because it trusts the token provider. Therefore, in addition to providing single sign-on, CBA eliminates the need for each application to authenticate the user individually. SharePoint 2010 and 2013 have the option of running web applications in a claims-based authentication mode. As noted on the slide, NetBackup supports Windows authentication, Facebook, LinkedIn, Windows Live ID, forms-based authentication using SQL Server, or Active Directory federated services. This slide lists some of the limitations of the NetBackup for SharePoint agent. For example, you cannot redirect SharePoint backups to a different web application for index files or databases, the farm configuration database, or for documents and folders, although with SharePoint 2010 and 2007, documents and folders can be redirected to a file system, which would assist in migrating them if that was called for. The important thing to remember is that SharePoint is a complex distributed application, and there can be limitations and caveats for certain types of web applications. The items listed on the slide here are some of the most common issues that we wanted to highlight. However, other limitations may apply for other types of data that may be hosted in SharePoint. It's strongly recommended when you work with the agent that you carefully review the NetBackup for SharePoint Administration Guide to see if there are any limitations that specifically apply to your environment. This slide lists additional limitations for NetBackup for SharePoint, most of them applying to restores. This is the Configuring NetBackup for SharePoint topic. This slide describes the prerequisites for getting started with NetBackup for SharePoint. First step is to make sure that your SharePoint configuration is supported by NetBackup and that the proper licensing is in place. For SharePoint, we use the Application and Database pack. Second step, we're going to configure the NetBackup client service and the legacy network service with a domain privileged account. In other words, a user account that's a member of the domain. Not a domain admin, but a domain user. Third step, configure the host properties for SharePoint clients with this domain account. Next step, configure the master server host properties for distributed applications with the SharePoint front-end servers and a back-end SQL servers. These steps here for configuration will be showing you in additional detail in subsequent slides. And then the fifth and final step directly relates to GRT backups if those are desired. First of all, check compatibility, because as with many applications, the requirements for GRT are sometimes a little more strict than the general requirements for the agent. Install the NFS components on the media servers and SharePoint SQL servers that will be mounting databases for GRT. That means the NetBackup media server and the back-end SQL servers on SharePoint. Configure the local security privileges for each SharePoint server. Again, more detail to follow about that. And verify that the SQL backend servers have an unassigned drive letter, because what will be happening is the databases will be mounted on an unassigned drive letter via NFS to enumerate their contents and index them for GRT purposes. And again, GRT backups will always go to disk. Can be any type of disk storage unit in NetBackup, but it's got to be disk. Because there are a fair number of prerequisites to check here and a number of items to keep track of, there is a SharePoint configuration checker utility which is available for download from Semantic Connect. Was developed by NetBackup support, and that can be very useful in doing a check of your environment to make sure that you have satisfied all of these prerequisites and to raise any red flags if there's anything we missed. Here's some additional detail on satisfying the prerequisites for NetBackup for SharePoint. First off, we'll talk about the domain account for NetBackup that we mentioned. This is essentially a service account that NetBackup is going to use to access the contents of the SharePoint farm to allow for backup and restore. And so this is an account that's created as a domain user, and the account requires local administrator rights on all servers in the farm. It requires SharePoint administrator privileges, and it requires the system administrator role on the back-end SQL servers. We're going to configure the NetBackup client service and the NetBackup Legacy Network service on the SharePoint clients to use this domain account to log on, and then restart the NetBackup services on all of the SharePoint clients. We're also going to specify a domain account, which usually will be this same account, in the NetBackup client host properties, which allows NetBackup servers access to SharePoint. Lastly, we're going to configure the local security policies for each SharePoint server for this account to allow logon locally, debug programs, logon as a service, and the right to replace a process level token. This slide shows the SharePoint client host properties, which is where we're going to enter the domain privileged account that we created for NetBackup's use in accessing the farm. This is usually the same account that the NetBackup client services are using to log in with, although it could be a different account as long as it had the correct permissions. And you'll notice there are a couple other options for SharePoint here as well, such as whether or not we're going to do a consistency check before the backup, and if we're going to do backups of our virtualized SharePoint farms using VMware policies, the name of the back-end SQL server in a SharePoint farm that's going to be browsing for purposes of GRT. Here's a close-up of the consistency check options in the SharePoint server host properties. We can either not do a consistency check, do a full check excluding indexes, or do a full check including indexes. And of course, the trade here is a more thorough check involves a longer backup time. Note that there is also a checkbox on the window here if the consistency check fails, whether or not you want the backup to proceed. Here's more detail about the distributed application restore mapping. This is a tab in the master server host properties. It's used with Exchange and SharePoint to make sure that servers have the correct permissions to restore data. Because what's going to happen when you back up SharePoint is the backup images are all going to get cataloged under the host name of the front-end server name. even though they may be originating from other servers, and we might want to do a restore to those other servers. So to allow NetBackup to restore content to any server in the farm, we're going to want to map the SharePoint Central Administration Server to the SQL backend servers that actually host the web applications. This slide details the NetBackup for SharePoint backup and recovery options. For complete protection of your SharePoint environment, it's often necessary to use multiple backup policies. And that's a difference between SharePoint and other NetBackup agents, particularly when we talk about agents that use GRT, like Exchange, for example. We take a single pass backup of the information store. That's my DR protection. I use GRT to be able to extract individual items from that backup. Basically one backup does it all. SharePoint is a little too complex for that, again, because it's a distributed application. And so we have different policies to satisfy different needs. If we want GRT, then we're going to configure backup policies specifically for granular backup and recovery. And these are going to be backups of the web applications on the back-end SQL servers that will allow for a restore of an entire web application or just one granular item within a web app. Then, if we want SharePoint farm level backups, we'll be using a different policy for that. And if we want complete disaster recovery protection, then in addition to the two SharePoint policies, doing GRT and farm backups, we'll also want to use a Windows policy to capture the system state, because there is some critical information in the Windows registry that's needed for full disaster recovery. This slide provides specific details about which SharePoint objects can be restored using GRT and which cannot be. And again, when we're protecting SharePoint, we're going to use different policies for GRT backups and non-GRT backups, which is different than the way a lot of other NetBackup agents behave. As you can see, there are some objects, and mostly they're system objects, like the configuration database, the single sign-on database, the global settings, and index files. These objects cannot be restored from GRT level backups at all, and so it is necessary to protect them with a separate policy. Typically, most of these objects, the system-level objects like the configuration database, you would only really be recovering in the scenario for a full farm restore. Then there are other objects, such as the web applications and content databases, which can be restored at the database level or restored at the GRT level, where individual items can be extracted for recovery. And so those can be protected with either GRT or non-GRT backups. Then you see there are certain types of items, the individual items within the web applications, like site collections and subsites, which can only be protected and restored using GRT backups. So as we've discussed, for complete protection of our SharePoint environment, including the capability to do granular recovery, we'll use multiple SharePoint policies. So the first SharePoint policy that we create is going to provide for granular backup and recovery. And there's a couple different examples on the slide here of how you might set up your GRT SharePoint policies. And the fact that these are doing granular recovery, remember, is a checkbox you have to hit on the first tab of the backup policy, the Attributes tab. And then the backup selections, we can either make a very general selection using the All Webs directive. The All Webs directive gets you the collection of all websites that are contained within the site collection, including the top-level site and its subsites. Or if I wanted to be more specific, I could specify a particular web application by name. One or more. I could put multiple on the policy if I wanted to. A recommended backup frequency for this would be a daily or weekly full, depending on the recovery point that you're looking for. And again, because we're doing GRT here, the initial destination for this must be a disk storage unit. Also note, as with most NetBackup agents that support GRT, GRT is only possible from full backups. There are some limitations that are specific to GRT-enabled jobs in NetBackup for SharePoint. The most significant ones are listed on the slide, and some of these we've talked about already, such as the fact that full backups are required to support GRT, either scheduled full or user-directed, and that backups must initially go to disk storage units. For a complete description of limitations that should be reviewed, check the NetBackup for SharePoint admin guide or the tech note referenced on the slide. Here's an example of my farm-level SharePoint backup policies. Now, these are a critical part of my disaster recovery strategy, the ability to recover the entire farm. This policy by itself doesn't get me full farm-level protection, but it's one of the things I need to get there. One of the considerations here is that the index files cannot be protected by incremental backups. Most other farm components can, the indexes can't. And so I need to allow for that in my planning, which is why we have kind of an either-or presented on the slide here. So the first option is to do this farm level protection with a single SharePoint policy. And so I use the Microsoft SharePoint Resources Directive, which captures all of the farm components. I create schedules as needed. In the example here, a weekly full backup and a daily incremental backup. That's reasonable. Remember that GRT must not be enabled on these policies. And in the exclude list, I'm going to do a schedule-specific exclusion so that the index files are excluded from the incremental backups. So they'll still be protected by the full, but not by the incrementals, which is easy to do in the client host properties. Now, an alternative to doing this, if I was willing to have two policies instead of one, was that I could protect the indexes using a whole separate policy. And that's that second option they're doing there with the B policies. So policy B1 backs up all SharePoint resources. We've got a weekly full and a daily incremental schedule, and we have completely excluded the index files from this policy using policy level exclusions. And then I've got a second policy, policy B2, also a SharePoint policy, but I'm specifying the indexes in that policy. And then, of course, there's no need for exclusions in that policy. I'm only protecting the indexes, and I'm only doing full backups. As mentioned previously, for complete disaster recovery of a SharePoint environment, multiple policies are necessary. We already talked about creating one SharePoint policy to do GRT and one or two additional SharePoint policies to protect the farm. In addition to the farm level backup for DR, I'm also going to need a Windows policy. And that Windows policy must back up the shadow copy components at a minimum because there's critical information in the Windows registry that's needed in order to protect fully protect the SharePoint environment. And so I've got a farm level backup being done here, and that's the SharePoint policy. And then the Windows policy is either going to do the shadow copy components, if all I want is the information in the registry, or I could do all local drives. And the difference there would be with all local drives, I get complete protection of the operating system and all of its components on the servers. Whereas if I only specify shadow copy components, I'm just getting what's in the registry. The assumption there being that the operating system maybe will be put in place by a provisioning tool, instead of using NetBackup for that recovery. Remember that that's an either or. Don't put shadow copy and all local drives on the backup selections list. Use one or the other. Now, this Windows policy will not be using GRT. It will support full or incremental backups, and I'm going to want to exclude any SharePoint databases from this Windows policy. This slide shows a set of 3 backup policies that kind of does everything for me. This is all stuff we've seen before, but it's kind of nice to put it all together here in one place. I've got 3 policies. One is a SharePoint policy that provides for GRT, so that's backing up all of my web applications. A second SharePoint policy is protecting the farm. And you'll notice I've chosen to go ahead and do schedule level exclusion of the indexes so that I can get away with having only one policy here instead of two for my farm level backup. And then the third policy, the Windows policy, is going to protect, well, let's say, for example, all local drives. So then I've got operating system level protection, and I've got the critical information that I need from the registry. So these three policies, at a minimum, are really what it takes for comprehensive protection of SharePoint for both GRT and disaster recovery purposes. Here's an example of configuring a SharePoint policy. So the policy type is SharePoint. I'm going to specify a destination storage unit. If this is a GRT backup, and it appears that it is because that box is checked off here, remember it needs to be a disk-based storage unit. Be very careful with that Enable Granular Recovery checkbox. Make sure it is selected for the policies that specifically will be doing GRT backups, and is not selected for the policies that will be doing farm-level backups. This slide is a nice reference for exactly which types of SharePoint objects can be protected by full and differential incremental schedules, as opposed to those that could only be protected by full. And the long story short, like we mentioned before here, is that it's basically the index files that can only be protected by full backup schedules. Here's an example of adding a schedule to a SharePoint policy. Note that I can do full backups, differential incremental backups, and optionally user backups. User backups are not required, but they're possible. I cannot do cumulative incremental backups for SharePoint Server. And so I select my schedule type, give it a name, select the retention level from here, and then I configure a start window, and if desired, exclude dates, the same as I would for any NetBackup schedule. Next, on the Clients tab, I specify the hostname of the front-end web server that runs the central administration service. And note that is the only client that needs to be added to the policy. NetBackup accesses the whole farm through the front-end server. Do note, however, that even though there's only one client on the list here, the NetBackup client software still needs to be installed on all front-end web servers, all SQL database servers, and all index database hosts. This slide shows an example of the backup selections list, and this is one of the things that's going to determine whether we're protecting web applications for GRT backups, or whether we're protecting all SharePoint resources in a farm-level backup. If we're going to be protecting individual SharePoint components, then it's best to use the Browse feature to select them, because it's very easy to mistype the long names that some of these SharePoint objects have. If I'm going to be using one of the higher level directives, for example the All Webs directive, then it's not usually necessary to browse. That's easy enough to type in. Here's an example of browsing for specific SharePoint backup selections. Note when browsing that if you've checked off the Enable Granular Recovery box on the Attributes tab, that your display here is going to be limited to only web applications. We mentioned that SharePoint policies support user backup schedules if that's desired. Here's an example of doing a user backup. From the bar console, I can browse the SharePoint resources and select individual objects. In this case, looks like I have a web application selected, and then back them up according to the parameters that are defined in the user backup schedule. This is the SharePoint Disaster Recovery Considerations topic. To assist in disaster recovery of a SharePoint farm, NetBackup incorporates a SharePoint Recovery Assistant. And this is not like a separate interface or anything like that. This is something that runs transparently in the background when you do farm-level restores for SharePoint. The Recovery Assistant allows you to restore an entire farm, a set of databases, a site, or documents, and the Assistant determines the sequence in which these resources are restored. This means that you don't have to manually restore SharePoint resources in a prescribed order. The Recovery Assistant takes care of that for you. The Assistant is going to launch a restore job for each database in a web application, and it's going to guarantee that databases are restored in a proper order to ensure that a working web application exists when the restore is complete. This slide shows a high-level summary of the steps to restore SharePoint resources, and you'll notice it's not all that different from standard file system restores in NetBackup. From the bar console, I'm going to make sure that Restore from Normal Backup is selected, and then I'm going to go to Specify NetBackup Machines and Policy Type, make sure that the source client is the front-end web server. Remember, all backup images are associated with that front-end server, and then set the policy type to be SharePoint. And then under the NetBackup history, I set a date range to browse for the images that I'm looking for. And then I expand the Microsoft SharePoint resources and select the specific objects I wish to restore, preview the media if I'm going to be restoring from tape, and then go ahead and select Actions and then Restore and review the restore options. Note that if I select multiple objects or an entire farm to recovery, the recovery assistant is going to run in the background transparently to kick off multiple restore jobs and to make sure that everything is recovered in a proper sequence without me needing to make any decisions about this. From my point of view, it's basically a single-click restore. Here's an example of what that looks like. We're using the Windows version of the bar console here, which is still present on Windows clients, so maybe this is a client-directed restore. I've made sure that I've selected to restore from normal backups, and then I'm going to see what backup images I have available and highlight the backup images that I want to browse. And then down in the All Folders pane, I'm going to select the objects that I wish to restore, and then go to Action Restore. Here's an example of doing a GRT restore. So just as before, I make sure that Restore from Normal Backup has been selected, and I select which images I wish to browse, and then in the All Folders pane, I expand the SharePoint resources, and I drill down to find the objects I'm looking for. Now, as is usual with GRT, the complete set of indexes are usually not loaded right away. There will be small little restores that happen in the background as I drill down in a tree. And so when I expand nodes in the tree, there'll be a slight delay before it expands as those indexes are restored. And of course, granular recovery means just that. I can be very granular in the objects I restore. You see in this example here, I have got a web application that I've protected, and I've drilled all the way down into the Shared Documents folder, and I'm selecting individual documents for recovery. After I select Restore, the Restored Marked Files window opens. Note that the General tab has options which do not apply to NetBackup for SharePoint. None of the options on this first tab apply. Any options that are going to be used in a SharePoint restore are selected from the second tab, the one that says Microsoft SharePoint. Here's a close-up of that Microsoft SharePoint tab with SharePoint-specific restore options. So, for example, if I'm restoring databases, do I want them brought online and fully reconnected? What do I want to do about versioning if I'm restoring individual objects? Those are the kind of things I can select from here. One of the options in the SharePoint tab is to redirect SharePoint resources being restored. So you can redirect the restore of a web application either to another web application or to an alternate SQL instance, or individual items can be directed to individual SharePoint sites, or in some cases to a file. Here's a few examples. In the first one here, we're going to redirect the restore of a web application to another web application. So in the URL box, I specify the URL of the destination site, and in the front-end web server name box, I specify the host name of the web server to which I wish to redirect. In this next example, I'm going to redirect a restore of a web application to an alternate SQL instance. So in the SQL Server instance box, I'm specifying the name of the target SQL Server and the target instance name. And in the target database box, I'm indicating the name of the target database. Be careful to specify only one database to redirect. If I select multiple databases, then all databases are written to the target database. Here's another example. In this case, there are individual SharePoint sites, documents, lists, or items that I wish to redirect to a drive or to a folder. So in the Restore to Drive or UNC path, I'm either putting down a path using a drive letter or a UNC path. If I restore to a drive path, then the restore will be redirected to the SQL backend server and not to the front-end server. And note that this feature applies only to SharePoint 2010 and 2007. In this lesson, you learned about the components that comprise a SharePoint farm. You learned how to configure NetBackup policies for protection of SharePoint farms, and you learned how to recover data. This concludes Lesson 7.